G'naiden, Barak, and good morning everybody else. This is a bit scary, I've never done this talk before, and just to let you know, if there's any difficult questions at the end, this will be dealt with by concealed female snipers. So, as well as being divided from family and home, there were other divisions that chaplains had to come to terms with. There was, of course, the differences of social background and education between officers and men, and these were a bigger barrier to chaplains because of their pastoral role. However, maybe it might have been different for chaplains at Gallipoli because the long sea voyage to the peninsula may have facilitated the forging of bonds. So, I'm going to do an introduction. So, as you can see from this slide, I won't read it all out, but there was a multiplicity of nationalities and faiths who fought at Gallipoli. It's a tricky subject, and apologies if I use any incorrect terms or mispronunciation during this talk. Perhaps you can let me know at the end. So, on the Ottoman side, there were not only Muslim Turks, but also Christians and other faiths as well. You had Christianity on the Allied side, Judaism on both sides. There was a multiplicity of religious faiths of the Indians and the Gurkhas, multiplicity of denominations of religions, and there were French colonial troops as well, just to name a few. This is a paper, as you can see, on conscription, and just to qualify what I said previously, in that Professor Zerker concluded that the system of exemptions to conscription in place in the Ottoman army meant that it was mainly made up largely of Muslims. So, one assumes that the holy war declared by the Sultan, even prior to when the Allies invaded the Dardanelles, would have had a deeper effect on the psyche of the Ottoman soldiers than if any similar declaration had been made by Western royalty. And the declaration was made the same day in Istanbul, and this apparently is the declaration, not that I can read it. So let's talk some numbers. The total numbers employed in the campaign on the British side was in the region of 469,000. And that was 328,000 combatants. The maximum strength at any one time was about 128,000 combatants. So now we have Peter Hart's book, where he informs us that on the Ottoman side, in 1914, the peacetime strength was approximately 200,000, and this could be expanded on mobilisation to between 500 and 800,000. So that's a lot of soldiers to provide a chaplaincy service for. So according to the aforementioned War Office stats, there were 12 to 14 chaplains to each division. But according to the original history of the 29th Division, when they set sail from Egypt, they only had 3 chaplains of the predominant religion, which is the Church of England. So the French, you can see the numbers for the other nationalities. So I really cannot say how many chaplains and imams would have been on the peninsula at any one time. Insofar as the Australians were concerned, a recent paper by two Australian academics, Daniel Reynaud and Larissa Miller, states perhaps no formal role in the AIF was so thinly staffed as the chaplaincy. Padres were never numerous at the best of times, and the conditions at Gallipoli, Lemnos and Egypt spread them even thinner. With regard to wastage through sickness, one chaplain evacuated to Alexandria said, "I wonder whether there will be any chaplains left on the peninsula. Alex is full of them, fit, wounded and sick." So the collections officer at the Gurkha Museum in Winchester informed me there was a dearth of information available about Hindu pandits during the First World War. However, he did find a reference from 1905 which shows each Gurkha battalion had a pandit on staff, thus heavily suggesting, he said, that this also would have been the case 10 years later. Was there a shortage of German chaplains? Well, the German embassy chaplain in Istanbul found his duties to be so numerous that he needed additional clerical support from Germany drafted in. He held religious services for soldiers in Istanbul and also at the Gallipoli front with fighting troops. He officially assumed the function of a Navy chaplain on the 31st of October 1915. In his memoirs, a pioneer, Adolf Horozek, remembered Christmas Day 1915 when a priest came from Istanbul to celebrate Christmas, hear confessions and give communion. Horozek said they hadn't confessed for a very long time. So on the left is another naval chaplain, and this name I can pronounce, so I'm going to tell you it's Ludwig Müller. So here we have a group of French soldiers and chaplains, not sure where. There were 1,500 French chaplains on mobilisation. There was no exemption to conscription for French priests. In 1914 to 18, about 32,000 priests served in the French army, often as nurses, stretcher bearers, but also as combatants. So here we have some stats from that book, and in August 1915, that where the red line is, there were 1,164 chaplains on all fronts, and the number of denominations had expanded from 3 in 1914 to 8. Noting no representatives from the Salvation Army, although there was at least one Salvationist, one Australian Salvationist who served on Gallipoli. The Army Chaplains Department became royal in 1919 and had grown from 117 chaplains in August 1914 to 3,416 in August 1918. According to the Australian War Memorial, during the course of the whole war, 414 chaplains served with the AIF. About a quarter of them were transport-only chaplains. The remainder made up of denominations according to the religious demographic of Australia. So we come to appointments and practicalities. So chaplains from nations of the British Empire were always volunteers, even after conscription came in. There was, as I've already said, an enormous expansion of the existing Army Chaplains Department, and growth of the new Australian Chaplains Department. But there was long-standing conscription in the Ottoman armies, and religious teachers had pivotal roles, whereas the role of the British Empire chaplains were not codified. There was long-standing conscription in France and Germany, which saw priests serving in many capacities. And this is a nice photo from a website of an ecclesiastical student in Nice who was conscripted as a stretcher bearer in August 1914. And another nice photo of regimental imams and you can see their uniforms of their turbans and their robes with the brocade on their sleeves to denote their class. So here we have two chaplains, and you can see that one of them is wearing a clerical collar, the other isn't, but they both wear the Maltese cross badges that denotes the Chaplains Department. And New Zealand were the same. This is from the New Zealand government website showing their insignia, and this group of chaplains were in France, New Zealand chaplains in France. And again, here we have Father Finn, who is not only wearing his clerical collar and showing his Maltese crosses on his uniform, and then we have a French Jesuit priest who also has a cross on his uniform. So back to this photo again. On the right, the chaplain has 5 chevrons on his left sleeve, indicating that he has already spent 3 years in the military zone. The second French chaplain in from the left seems to wear around his neck the tablets of the 10 Commandments. This is an example of a contract signed by a British chaplain. Most were class 4 with the relative rank of captain. But interestingly, I've discovered that although they had the relative rank of captain, their pay was more in alignment of that of a lieutenant. Their service was only for 12 months when they signed the contract, but most chaplains renewed their contract. Australia based their contracts on this. This particular contract was signed 12 months after Father Doyle volunteered, because the Chaplain General's Department had been inundated with applications. They had over 1,200 across all denominations by October 1914, and the department could not cope with the volume. There was a lack of training on the British side, although booklets were issued in 1917. It was more a case that the role was established by precedents and convention rather than any kind of formal training. So these quotes: "We were a disorganised body, each playing his own lone hand. There was no definite public policy, no one to train us, no one to lead. Each had to learn his work by experience of his failures. Even 1 month spent at some preliminary school of army training would have paid a handsome dividend and saved him many needless efforts." And the Australian War Memorial confirms that the chaplain used his own initiative to determine the nature and extent of his duties. So some army chaplains had their own portable communion sets, but if you had an official one, this was the instruction by the War Office for what your responsibilities were. And I won't read it out. This is an example of a portable communion set. The Reverend John Kenneth Best on Gallipoli said, "Kinloch has gone off with a bad tummy. I never thought he would stick it, in such a hurry that he left his communion set, which I promptly borrowed." He also had to beg for communion wine, Go to see Hall, read communion wine. Like a stupid old woman, he showed me a bit of temper. Meet a chaplain who is also after wine. We go together to French hospital and dear old curé supplies us with 2 bottles of red. He fairly bustled around to find bottles, corks, etc. This is a photo of an Australian chaplain conducting a communion service where he needed 2 biscuit boxes with a cloth spread over the top for his altar. And Best again recorded in his diary using a dixie for an altar. By contrast, the role of imams had long been formalised. They had long been part of the staff of army barracks, providing religious and moral education, leading prayers, taking religious services, including burials. They also taught reading, writing, calculus, and a regulation of the 31st of March 1914 said imams were to be directors of battalion schools. On promotion, regimental imams became muftis. And as soon as Turkey mobilised, extra imams and muftis were appointed, including to the Navy. Soldiers and their loved ones were fully aware that the war was a religious duty. The state also appointed extra preachers in Istanbul to boost morale. It was the imam's role to increase soldiers' efforts before and during the attack. On the other hand, the experience of newly appointed chaplains to the expanding empires of the armies of the British Empire was dealing with large numbers of men, many of whom had little religious sentiment or even experience. So now, combatant faith. Both sides were clear that even someone of a different faith or even the enemy should be buried according to sacred rites. So Reverend Father Henry Chapman of the Royal Naval Division noted, many bodies of Turks lay behind the line and were being buried daily, and the question at issue was whether or not we should hold a short service over their graves. It was agreed that no Mohammedan should be buried without a short service in which the Lord's Prayer should form a part. On the death of a German sub-lieutenant Verman during the bombardment of the outer forts, killed at the Oranje battery on the 19th of February, he was laid to rest by a hokka underneath a Turkish flag. His face was turned towards Mecca. A nice picture of Fort Hamidi and the funeral of 3 German naval ratings. Speaking from the pulpit, the German Navy chaplain Muller and Catholic chaplain Father Hieronymus commemorated the heroes of the 18th of March. The Turkish soldiers raised their hands in prayer, and the German comrades followed their example by putting their elbows to the side and opening their hands upwards. There were also readings from the Quran. So this wide-ranging symposium included a discussion of the role of imams and the claim that the Ottoman victory at Gallipoli was the outcome of a strong belief in Islam. Historically, imams had been appointed to the Turkish army from 1380. They were fluent in Arabic and Turkish, and it was a strong belief in Islam that brought together youth of different ethnicities. Preachers were sent to the peninsula and to mosques in Istanbul to boost morale. Regimental imams led the men both in prayer and accompanied them into battle. Some fell as martyrs. Many commentators have highlighted the bravery of the Turks and their war cry. The Reverend Crichton said, "The Turks' positions only get stronger every day. They are magnificently led, well armed and very brave and numerous. The Reverend Best referred to the Turkish soldier as the finest in the world. So here we have an example of the importance of the 5 daily prayers of those engaged in jihad. However, a fatwa was issued to excuse soldiers whose circumstances meant that they could not pray or fast on religious holidays. By contrast to the seeming consensus that faith was a strong motivator for Ottoman soldiers, note some conclusions from the study of Anglicanism during the Great War. Fair enough, some soldiers retained the devout Christian faith they held in civilian life, and others were converted. There again, in the majority of officers and men, however, Anglican chaplains met with indifference to conventional forms of Christian worship and ignorance of Christian doctrine. Padres learnt that despite the hopes of some commentators, war was a poor reviver of religion. Note that these quotes and book largely relate to the Western Front, and of course it is a very complex subject, hence 250 pages devoted to the study. Interestingly, 2 recent studies by Australian historians came to different conclusions. Bill Gamage concluded that the First World War Australian soldier was indifferent to religion, whilst Reynard and Myler found evidence to the contrary in half of the diaries they studied. So here is the Reverend Kenneth Best, who said, "No one scoffs at religion now. Nobody jeers when fellows say prayers in trenches. Arranged for Holy Communion, went to borrow communion set. To my surprise, regardless of shrapnel, about 100 men were present. Had a delightful evening service at twilight in the 4th East Lancs lines. At 7 p.m, about 200 men present and a dozen officers lying in dugouts. Typewritten note being circulated to show Turks on last legs. This is a childish and mistaken way of trying to keep the men's spirits up. Many men wish for services to be held to boost their morale. Many men want Holy Communion, had short prayers in various parts of the trenches. Nearly all knelt most reverently and added an amen, which clearly came from their hearts." Praise for chaplains of all denominations attached to the 10th Irish Division in Gallipoli, which said, "Walking about at Anzac and Suvla was neither pleasant nor safe, but the chaplains were quite indefatigable and would walk any distance and brave any danger to visit the units to which they were attached." Was there anti-clericalism in the French army? Well, I would have liked to have had a look, but it cost £20 to download this. Suffice to say, there were 1,500 French chaplains on mobilisation. Therefore, religion was catered for despite the separation of church from state in 1905. But it obviously was a bit of a problem, because these are the observations of Father Willie Doyle in France, when he said, "The more I see of France, the more I am puzzled what to think of the religious state of the country. It is quite apparent that indifference is very widespread, though the curés say the people as a whole do not lose the faith." So these 2 memoirs, neither Alec Riley nor Frank Laird had much to say about religion in them. Surprisingly, with regard to Frank Laird, because he came from a Methodist family, a strong Methodist family, and spent a few years as a Sunday school teacher. As far as Gallipoli is concerned, he merely describes waiting to be evacuated wounded from Suvla Bay on the 10th of August 1915 and referred to a Presbyterian chaplain and a medical officer doing all they could for him. Riley was a signaller, and while repairing breaks in the line one day, he refers to coming across dead men, equipment and personal belongings, amongst which were Bibles and prayer books. When a senior officer was wounded in the throat, Riley says he refused stretcher bearers and walked to the main hospital on W Beach with a chaplain praying alongside him as he walked. So fatalism was obviously prevalent, and this is a good quote from Father Henry Day. "My Batman used to accompany me as an orderly on these journeys. We were regularly shelled or sniped at. I was never hit and he was only once slightly wounded. This was extraordinary luck." 3 weeks was considered the average length of immunity from gunshot wound at Suvla. No wonder people touched wood and came to believe in Kismet. So on the ground, a nice photo of RAMS Alunia here. So on the ground or at sea, started with the long journey to Gallipoli via Egypt. By the time the Allied units landed in Gallipoli, chaplains had had many months to build a rapport with their flock. The good ones used their time wisely in organising concerts, sports, competitions, lectures, etc., as well as putting a lot of thought into the content and delivery of their sermons. Skillful chaplains impressed, but there were mediocre ones too who did not escape the attention of their colleagues. Chaplain Walter Dexter of the AIF vented his opinion in the diary he kept during his service on the peninsula about unfit, intolerant and inflexible chaplains. The Reverend Kenneth Bess praised one priest in his diary, going on to say that he was far nicer than one in his division who rules his flock by fear. So the images here show Gully Ravine. For both sides, much of the terrain did not allow for a chaplaincy service other than for providing the absolute essentials. Bringing the ministry from beach field ambulances to trenches was challenging and dangerous. So the host of support services which could greatly impact on the emotional well-being of a soldier, such as those organised by chaplains on the Western Front, could rarely be provided in Gallipoli because of the terrain and the small area of the battlefield, even in the more flat areas. Nevertheless, Reverend Kenneth Bess noted, helped to arrange a sing-song, got some men together and had a bit of a concert. Brigadier General and a good many officers present. Stage was a semicircular ledge on the side of cliff between Wye and Gully Beach. We sat on boxes covered in blankets and men squatted up and down the cliffside. So Turkish soldiers in Istanbul were lucky in this respect, as can be seen from the photo, which is a photo of a concert in Istanbul. As far as their allies are concerned, in October 1915, when the German embassy chaplain travelled to Berlin to recruit additional pastoral assistants, he also organised the funding of a soldiers' club in Istanbul, which was opened in December. Joining men in swimming was a good way for chaplains who did so to bond with the men, as well as being refreshing and a chance to clean up, except that Father Day recorded, "At the sea we made a practice of bathing. Everyone did who could. The chance of getting one's clothes off for a bathe was not to be missed. Unfortunately, in my case, I eventually discovered to my horror that my clothing had contracted vermin out of the sand. The Reverend Bess recorded, "Off to bathe, sea like a mill pond, back to bury 3 men at RAMC, move headquarters back a bit, play cricket of sorts in between, attended to wounded and burials. Callous? No. Only way to prevent melancholia. Game abandoned, shrapnel stopped play." So we come to the important role of the chaplains helping with the RAMC, and the Reverend Crichton offered help to the field ambulance in April 1915. He lacked confidence at first. "I felt I could only be interfering and could do no good." But he gradually started to become proactive, making himself useful, and helped establish a very snug dressing station in Aberdeen Gully where the patients might be secure and undisturbed while shells burst overhead. And of course there were also field ambulances inland, which is a group of imams with convalescing soldiers at Chinakali. And as well as in the field, Padres and imams had an important role to play in base hospitals and hospital ships. These are some diary entries from Father Murphy, chaplain to 10th Irish Division. August 15th, started from ambulance to bivouac of Dublins and Munsters at 4 a.m. August 16th, found chaplains and medical men busy at ambulance. August 17th, went up with stretcher party to advanced dressing station at 9 p.m. and returned at 5 a.m. to ambulance. Of course, not all men recovered, so an important duty was the burial service and associated record keeping. After a nighttime burial, Crichton wrote, "I had to read the service by the light of my electric torch. I feel it is the only consolation we can give the relatives at home. We also consecrate the graves." And of course there were burials at Lemnos because there were hospitals there, and this is the first mention I found of Canadian soldiers on Gallipoli. This is where the 1st and 3rd Canadian Stationery Hospital was. Father Day said, "In the line I undertook funerals for all denominations when asked, and as it was inconvenient to fetch chaplains from the coast for the purpose, my services were much in demand." And here are the last 2 burials that he conducted in daylight before switching to night time. And these graves were not obviously these ones, but the original ones were shelled immediately afterwards. So an important role was the distribution of books and various items like that. Reading materials were greatly coveted. The Reverend Crichton complained about lack of newspapers getting through. The Reverend Bess shared what books he had and referred to rereading a book because it was better than having nothing to read. And on that basis, men of religion and no religion probably welcome Reverend Crichton's distribution of Gospels and the New Testament. And as you can see from this quote, people were keen. The one at the bottom, "You will write to my wife if I get pipped." Right, again, I'm not going to read all of this letter, but this is the letter from the Reverend H. Foster to the widow of Petty Officer Peter Iredale, a familiar name. Was it an accurate account, or was the widow spared unpleasant details? I don't know. But the letter says that the popular petty officer, Peter, was shot and died instantaneously, and that Peter's brother Henry and others dug a beautiful grave and buried him devoutly and tenderly. I said the last prayers of the church over him. So the record was taken, and as you can see from the first part of the slide, the record was there, but unfortunately post-war the remains were never identified, and he is commemorated at the Cape Helles Memorial. This is very much a hands-on chaplain, Salvationist Scottish-Australian William Mackenzie. He rolled up his sleeves to help carry water. He is reported on one night to have cut out steps in the steep track to ensure as little water as possible was lost in the delivery. So we come to, were they in the front line, were they behind the line? In the original official history of the Chaplains Department, it was maintained that a soldier would rather have listened to an indifferent discourse from a Padre who had been with him in the trenches than a brilliant one from a Padre who had remained at the back. These are brilliant photos of an imam in the front line holding a gun, training a gun over a parapet. Whilst Allied chaplains were unarmed, Turkish imams could combine their religious duties with fighting. Some were killed and thereafter referred to as martyrs. The day after the first landings, the Reverend Crichton felt very blue about being confined to the ship and subsequently to the field ambulance on the beachhead. Soon, though, restrictions were forgotten. Chaplains started to decide for themselves, and Crichton ventured beyond the field ambulance towards the firing line. His lack of confidence in an alien environment met with abuse on several occasions, but he soon forged a role for himself. He was eventually killed whilst visiting a forward gun battery south of Arras in the spring of 1918. So we all know about Father Finn, I assume, and he was one of the chaplains who railed against restrictions right from the off, and he followed his men from the SS River Clyde at V Beach at Helles. Crichton said, "I have since heard that Father Finn asked to be allowed to land with his men and had been put into one of the first boats and was shot either getting off the boat or immediately getting ashore. The men never forgot him and were never tired of speaking of him." One admires Finn's devotion to his men. Hindsight says maybe he was naive, but how was he to know? This is a lantern slide from the IWM of Father Finn's original grave and my photo of his CWGC grave. This is a French Jesuit priest who died of shrapnel wounds at Gallipoli. He got the Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur, and the citation says, "Military chaplain, full of spirit, of a calm and smiling courage, not hesitating to go in the middle of frontline troops to embolden the combatants, console the wounded, comfort the dying, was killed on the 9th of June 1915 in an advanced position of the French lines." He also got the Croix de Guerre Palm. And here we have the French Embassy German chaplain who came under fire several times during visit to the front lines and received the Iron Cross second class. Battleships and also hospital ships were vulnerable to long-range shelling, as we have heard, hence imams and chaplains were exposed to the possibility of severe injury or death. It's difficult to find names of Turkish imams who were martyred, and here's one killed on a battleship, and I do not intend to try to pronounce his name. A couple of graves of regimental muftis. Back to Fighting Mac, or was it rose-tinted spectacles? There are accounts, probably exaggerated, of Mackenzie being renowned for attacking with troops, such as leading a charge with a shovel. However, unlike his colleagues, Reverend Dexter and Father Fahey, he did not deny them. But what he did undoubtedly do was follow behind the attacking troops at Lone Pine on the 6th of August, and in the confusion of the trenches he sorted the living from the dead. He dug and filled graves himself, as well as saying the burial service, and had no rest for 3 days. Now we come to another Scottish Australian, the Reverend Andrew Gillison, who died of wounds on the 22nd of August 1915 after being hit by a sniper. He and 2 stretcher bearers had crawled out to no man's land to retrieve a wounded soldier. I don't know the fate of that soldier or one of the stretcher bearers, but the other one, Corporal Robert Pittendry, later died on a hospital ship. Gillison is described as a larger-than-life character who took a keen interest in the men, no matter their religion or denomination, fearless under fire, and was tireless in his care for the wounded and the dead. And this is a memorial to him. His popularity was such that it led to a subscription for his memorial, and 2 services attracted such large congregations that people could not gain entrance to the church. So I've forgotten the source of this, I'm sorry, but I have noted that there were 3 Victoria Crosses awarded to chaplains during the Great War, none in Gallipoli. There were 96 DSOs, but not all were for gallantry. There were 572 military crosses, including bars. By the end of the war, over 100 chaplains had died as a result of enemy action, and yet more scores of others had been wounded or invalided through illness. So an effective chaplain is a good communicator and a conduit for raising morale. This shows, or we should have shown, a study by Reynard and Miller that provided positive quotes from diaries, letters regarding chaplains, recording how soldiers took comfort from their services. But then there is how not to do it. The quote, "He is easily one of the old school, makes the sermon, in fact the whole service, as dull and melancholy as possible, with the supreme idea that one's awful past and fear for the future punishment will bring them nearer the church and God." Here we have Corps Commander Esat Pasha, who also states in his memoirs that the imams of the battalion advanced in front of the soldiers with the Quran in their hands. So that is the ultimate outreach. Working in partnership, this is a photo of a field ambulance. Henry Day said the skill and devotion of doctors who work through the long hours of darkness, only aided by candlelight, were wonderful. When I referred these urgent cases to the doctor, they treated them immediately. Crichton said, "Of all the medical work I saw in hospitals and elsewhere, I saw a great deal. Nothing could exceed the devotion of the regimental doctors, orderlies and stretcher bearers." Aha! So they had multi-denominational meetings and not all were successful. The private diary entries of the Reverend Kenneth Best, such as these, translate, I think, into an empathetic ministry towards his men. He said, "I wonder how many staff officers have been through the mill. They cannot grasp the situation from dug-out maps. They must understand and study men more. They don't realise what modern warfare is like and what human nature can stand. Walked with one," you can almost hear him holding his nose, "hardly any shrapnel, yet he would only walk near dugouts. At slightest noise he would bolt inside. Later I heard him court-martial a poor boy of 15 whose nerve had gone after a week's murderous fighting. It makes one's blood boil. So again, Reynard and Myler found that men preferred having their letters censored by chaplains rather than officers. Best, again, afternoon down to 4th East Lanc stores, held the service and had a grumble about their language. I talked very straight, saying that I do not object to barrack room language in itself, but to the mental cesspit it implied and in part produced. Instead of being offended, they asked me to come again as soon as possible. So from the history of the 10th Irish Division, who were exceptionally fortunate in its chaplains, according to its author, and he picked out the jewel of the Protestant chaplains was Canon MacLean on the left here. Although he must have been nearly 60 years of age, no dangers or hardship were too great for him, and when seriously ill with dysentery, he absolutely refused to go sick and leave his men. More assessment of the chaplains from that book. Father Farrell had a boyish keenness. Father O'Connor had a straightforward charm. The Reverend Hutchinson and Crozier were untiring and devoted. Father Stafford was praised for sharing knowledge. The Reverend Roche laboured unceasingly. And the aforementioned Canon MacLean had the heart of a boy and the courage of a lion. Father Murphy was praised for his robust cheerfulness. So the ministry of chaplains was also interrupted by illness, wounds and death. The majority of the chaplains that I have mentioned suffered from severe illness at one point or another and had to be evacuated for treatment. Some of them came back. Father Mackenzie reputedly lost 5 stone in weight. The Reverend Foster declined to renew his contract. The Reverend Best recorded in his diary, Foster, RND chaplain, is going home, nerves shattered. So I have a quick skim through the historiography, which sounds good. I'm not really sure if it's the term. This was a photo of my small collection of books on chaplains in the First World War. As well as describing their own work, they provided varying degree of narrative of events, description of surroundings and terrain at different locations. They record their attitudes to the people they interact with at all levels, other personal thoughts and philosophies and emotions, and record their own health issues. So this paper, if you want to look at it, is very interesting, but you'll have to use the online translation. Again, that one was £20 to download, so I don't know. The man, the myth, the legend. This is Mackenzie again, and I think the book on the left probably refers to the legend. The image on the right that's supposed to be there is another paper which explores the myths and gives a more balanced view. There are some modern studies in my collection. One you've already seen an image of that was supposed to be here again, Faith Under Fire, Edward Madigan, and the Royal Army Chaplains Department, Clergy Under Fire by Michael Snape. And if anyone wants to ask me for a list of the sources I've used for this talk, I'm quite happy to email them to you. Right. Some of these books are available in modern reprint, some of them aren't. This is my favourite Gallipoli chaplain. You can't see him, but you've seen images of him before. It's a prayer for Gallipoli by the Reverend Kenneth Best. And his diary entry for Wednesday, the 12th of May 1915 says, "Girl of 14 taken sniping in full sniping war paint." And this, finally, I think it came up last time. No. This is my favourite quote from his book. Ian Hamilton is now on the peninsula. He is said to have sent one general home in disgrace because he criticised. Ian will have to look to his laurels, methinks. And that is the end. A nice image of the R.E. Bonu Memorial in Gallipoli